Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains crazy. Yep. And today, we are going to discuss more objects of mad, unchecked, uncompromising science. Except this time we're going to talk about tanks. This was actually a request thing, as people seem to really like me talking about mad science experiments, really just experimental things in general, as they do tend to be the most interesting and the most just nuts. And we're going to do tanks this time. Here are 5 tanks that are clearly just mad science experiments. Clearly. I don't know why you would think anything else. There's no way that there was anything but madness going into these. Unquestionably. The Praying Mantis machine gun carrier. What are we looking at? It isn't even technically a tank. Well, it did have armor and tracks, so I guess you could call it a tank, but it was only really meant to have a machine gun. And, it elevated the machine gun up in the air. This is the UK experiment that was worked on between 1937 and 1944, though it never left the prototype stage because it's ridiculous. Now, to its credit, the design here and the ethos is actually not that nuts. Like, it was fundamentally sound in terms of the thought process here. Since it could elevate its gun, the idea was that it could stay concealed behind further cover and shoot over walls that other tanks would, like, have to shoot through. First of all, the internals on this thing are absolutely insane. You'd think the crew of 2 might be in the bottom part of the tank, because that makes the most sense. But no, you fool. You fool! Did you really think that they would do something like that? No. See the arm? That's where they were. Effectively in a long, hollow box. Both the driver and the gunner would be lying down in a prone position inside their box with their heads towards the machine gun turret. The crew's feet would be above a hydraulic system that would be able to raise the entire compartment up to about a 55-degree angle. The maximum elevation of this thing was 11.5 feet. Or 3.48 meters off the ground. That's impressive, but this is just absurd for the crew. It was very difficult to control in the position they were in, and when they attempted to move it while the gun was raised, it gave them motion sickness. The only benefit, since it was an armored vehicle, was that it could be used for effective troop cover, but that was about all it was good for. One of the prototypes is actually at the Tank Museum in Bovington, so you can go see this thing if you really want to. The M4A2 Sherman T10 Mine Exploder. Okay, speaking as an American, did we have to make the M4 look like a children's toy? That is clearly a steamroller, but it's a tank, but it's got, what are you doing? Well, again, much like the Praying Mantis, the logic here wasn't unfounded. As the name implies, this was meant specifically to run over and get rid of mines. The M4s actually had a lot of variants that did this sort of thing. One involved rotating chains, another involved a roller, but instead of the wheels replacing the treads, it just pushed the giant roller. This was a bit more excessive and arguably more ridiculous. They stripped it of its tracks entirely, as well as the running gear, so that the front-mounted differential could be coupled to the oversized wheels. Additionally, they noted the risks to the crew. This thing didn't have a crew on board, it was remotely operated, which is quite forward-thinking. I like that thought. The armor of it was actually cut back at the front of the sponsons, and the rear floor thickness was increased to 25 millimeters, since, you know, the mine's exploding underneath it. I mean, even with a crew not on board, it could disable it. We didn't want that. But this didn't work at all. The wheels tended to accumulate mud very easily due to the void spaces between them, and that prevented them from penetrating the ground properly, reducing their effectiveness overall. Additionally, it had a habit of getting stuck. Only the 2 front rollers were actually powered, and due to their lack of traction, they couldn't always pull the rear roller out of the mud. As Captain Merritt D. Elliott put it, From all indications, it seems the Ordnance Department is making any and every kind of device to remove mines. It's possible he was being a little facetious with that comment. It didn't work, is the point. But it was an interesting idea. Definitely crazy looking, certainly fun to talk about, but it was never deployed, because, yeah. The Soviet-Russian Gasdynamic trawler, Progvev-T. Now that we've seen how we do it in America, let's talk about how they do it in Soviet Russia. What? Why? That's horrifying, actually. That legitimately, without question, does look like a mad science experiment. It actually looks like a laser mounted on tank treads, but it's not a laser. It's actually arguably more ridiculous. That's a jet engine. What? Why would they do that? Well, for the same reason as we put big wheels on the M4s, this is a mine destroyer. The idea was that they would use a jet engine that was taken from a MiG-15 and use the heat and blast effect disable landmines. They mounted the engine. In fact, at one point it was 2 jet engines, because when one didn't work, they were like, oh, let's just add a second one. That'll obviously make it better. On a T-55 hull, and that made it weigh about 37 tons, which is pretty heavy, but the hull could take the weight. That wasn't the problem. The problem, well, there were a few. The concept of destroying mines this way isn't necessarily unfounded. Like, it could do that, but not quietly. Jet engines are loud! Really loud! And a tank isn't exactly quiet either. Given how heavy it was, plus the noise, everyone in the relative area knew when this thing was clearing mines. And it turns out enemies don't like it when you clear their mines out. You kind of want to try to do that a little bit quietly, if you can. This did the opposite of that. Everyone knew when it was doing that. And even though the idea technically should have worked on landmines, it wasn't necessarily an assured thing. The mines could still not go off because of the heat, or possibly still stay in the ground, depending on how well implanted they were. It wasn't necessarily a guarantee that this would clear any mines. And that's not something you want to hear about any mine-sweeping operation. Well, it might have cleared them. What do you mean, might have? You gotta send us in there. Like, what? We want to guarantee that the mines aren't there, not a possibly maybe. That's exactly what this was. When the idea of clearing mines didn't really work that well, they actually attempted to use it to knock out oil well fires. Oh hi, this is where I get to amend a complete screw-up on my part due to some sources incorrectly attributing this picture with, well, what we were talking about. This isn't the Soviet tank. This is not what that is. This is the Hungarian Big Wind. Big Wind has a similar concept. It's still jet engines, this time from a MiG-21, on a T-34, but this one was never meant to clear landmines. That idea was thrown out the window when the Soviets found out it didn't work. This was intended for fighting oil well fires. There are actually several other designs, some that were developed by the Soviets for this purpose, and Big Wind has proved itself, particularly in Kuwait, fighting these oil well fires. It actually works through a combination of water and the jets. It smothers the flames out. Overkill? Well, not with an oil well fire. Those are really hard to put out. This actually might be exactly what you need. It's still mad science, but it's totally different design, and I apologize for the previous error I made. Big Wind actually turned out to be a particularly good element of mad science, since it is proven to be actually legitimately effective, where everything else, well, wasn't. The Boirault machine, which I'm hopefully pronouncing right. Also, what the heck is that? Is it under construction? Is that just a frame to hold it up? No, that's the whole thing. I promise you that. This is considered a rather early take on what a tank should be. It actually predates modern tanks entirely, to the point that it's arguable if this even counts as a tank, but it was too ridiculous for me not to talk about. It's a French experimental landship that was designed in 1914 and actually put together in 1915. The idea was to try to help with the immobility of trench warfare. Trench warfare is very slow, tedious, time-consuming. Tanks came out of World War I for a reason, because they could do breakthrough maneuvers a lot easier than regular infantry. That's why the British Mark tanks were so effective. Their odd angular look was specifically so they could go over trenches. The French actually came out with this idea even before the British had the Mark Is in the field. It actually predates the design and development of the UK's Little Willie tank, which was effectively the prototype of the Mark tanks, by about 6 months. But, like, you get there early, but that doesn't mean it worked very well, because it didn't. Now, maybe the thought process here is sound, and to be fair, at the time, no one really knew what a tank looked like, or what it should be. The center motor and tracks effectively move the giant frame around it. The frame could be used to go over trees, barbed wire, and other things that are on a trench warfare battlefield. But there were a few issues with it. For one thing, it was not very heavily armored, so it could be very easily crippled without much effort from enemies. Also, it was cripplingly slow, even by standards of that time, and it really had trouble changing direction, which, actually I can believe that. That sounds about right. And much like Russia's Tsar tank, it was tall, very easily spotted in the battlefield too. Some of those that actually worked on it called it Diplodocus militaris, which is a reference to the giant sauropod dinosaur on account of its massive size and perceived insane slowness. But they didn't give up on this concept, at least not completely. A second Boirault machine was actually constructed between 1915 and 1916. This one had a crew of 3 and was made much more compact and lighter. It actually had armor in it for the engine and the driver compartment. This time it used 6 metal plates that rotated around the core chassis, and did have some level of steering control, which allowed for a turning radius of 100 meters, which is god-awful, but still better than the first one. What wasn't better than the first one was the speed. It moved at 1 kilometer an hour. Let me repeat that, just in case you missed it. It moved at 1 kilometer an hour. Not 2, not 3, 1. That was its max speed. For reference, most of us can walk faster than that. It was embarrassing, even at the time. But to its credit, it could actually cross the terrain that it was designed to. It got across railroad tracks, flattened barbed wire, and could cross trenches. Its strength was impressive, but the speed and the poor steering meant that even this didn't work out so well, and the project was abandoned by the end of 1916. Instead, the French would focus on the Snyder CA-1, which is a much more conventional looking tank. Though it also had problems, it wasn't quite as crazy as, well, these other two. I think we could agree on that. The Kugelpanzer! I'm not surprised that Germany during World War II hit #1 on a mad science list when it comes to tanks, but what are we looking at? That's a ball. Yep, that's what that is. And the concept actually dates back to the end of World War I, when the Germans were messing around with something they called the Triffus wagon. Even an American inventor had an idea for one in 1936, which he called the tumbleweed tank, but that never left the drawing board. This obviously did, as it was actually built, and it seems to be one of a kind, and somehow it wound up in the hands of the Japanese. The Germans aren't noted for having actually used the thing at all, and why they sent it to Japan is a mystery, and also what it was even really for. Yes, it's some sort of tank-like vehicle, but it's very round, and doesn't seem to have any armament, like, at all. It was captured by the Red Army towards the end of the conflict, and it's believed to have been sent to Japan as part of Germany's technology-sharing policy with their other allies. Though that's only one report that says it was even in Japan. That was in 1945 in Manchuria, but another says that it was actually captured at the Kummersdorf proving grounds along with the infamous Mouse tank. Whether that's true or not is unclear, but what is clear is that this thing is ridiculous. It might have been able to mount a machine gun, but it's believed that it must have been a one-man scouting vehicle, as its armor is very thin and wouldn't have lasted long against most modern tanks, like, at all, and even its mobility is questionable. It has a single-cylinder 2-stroke engine, which would have meant it could go only 8 kilometers an hour, and most pictures are like this, showing it from the front, leading people to believe that it's somehow balanced on this giant wheel arrangement, but that's not entirely true. It has a smaller wheel behind it. That helps keep it stable and probably help with steering. But again, as for what it was for, it's kind of mysterious in that regard. The Soviets were very secretive about what they actually found on it when it came to reports, and even today Russia actually keeps information on this thing closely guarded, despite having it on display. Taking metallurgical samples, for example, is completely forbidden, so even now we don't really even know what it's exactly made of. But that being said, Russia never attempted to copy this design at all as far as anybody knows. It's not like they were keeping some elusive, secretive technology, because they would have used it. The Soviets would have used it and put it into practice for themselves. So it's probably not anything exciting, but it still would be kind of interesting to know exactly what details they're holding back from people in terms of just what this thing is and what it is for. But sadly, this is about all I can tell you. It remains a mysterious element in terms of tank design history, just because of the secretive nature of the Russian archives. And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundude 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsu 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, DM Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dimeblade 17, Anzac A1, Alaric Jaspers, Tommy Rossini, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, and Ty Hammonds Jr. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.